overload of content. I was just talking about gender inequality. That was the last topic we had to cover in a way. Then we can do some kind of review together. And then we're talking about evaluation results. And for gender inequality, I'll focus on Latin America. For the first part, to show you some data on this. But like the first statement from America is, it's kind of the topic that most of my research focuses on, which I wrote my PhD thesis. And I guess, so to me, this is a bit like a question which is a bit like the question of why are some countries richer and some countries poor? It's one of those kind of fundamental questions. Like why do we have kind of this? If you put yourself in a very naive, ask those very naive questions, why is it the case that we have kind of a situation where half of the world population, women, are systematically, in some way or another, disadvantaged, discriminated? What is it? How should we understand this from an economic point of view? Why is this kind of an equilibrium of our societies? I'm going to present this first fact. And then what's interesting is there's a lot of variation, right? In some societies, inequalities are larger than in others, or they appear in different forms. Okay? But I guess to give you a feeling, this is something that, for which again, neoclassical economics is maybe very useful as a benchmark to ask the naive question. Right? Think of a model. Any model we might have studied on, I don't know, labor supply or consumer behavior, and then it is very hard to say how could we, starting with those models, generate the gender inequalities that we see, right? Unless you kind of decide, okay, we just assume men and women are fundamentally different, they have different preferences, and then it's kind of tautological. You say they have different preferences, then of course the model will predict that they have different differently. But that's maybe not a very fruitful or productive way. That's the same as saying some countries are rich and some countries are poor because they have different cultures and they have different appetites for economic growth. It's kind of well, then we can all go home, right? We have nothing to discuss if that's already the answer. And so I think what's interesting is, why would, if you think of labor supply model, where people decide how much they want to work, depending on the wage they can earn, and their preferences for leisure, why this would imply a world where we have this fundamental inequalities in labor markets between men and women. And then what's interesting is you see immediately the kind of neoclassical economics won't do the job, and we need something else. And that's when things get interesting. Right? What is this something else that is missing? So I think starting with the model helps you to figure out what would be some of the suspects, some of the elements of my case. To give you one example, one data point, do you know what is the female labor force participation in India? Labor force participation meaning people who either are employed, could be self-employed, so they could be working at home, or looking for a job, so unemployed. What is the share of women in India today that is participating in the labor force? Roughly. 40%. No. Sorry. Maybe what is the share of men? So adult men, so like between, think of like men between 25 and 54, or between 16 and 16. 80% maybe? It's about 95%. So basically, if you stop at 64, so after that people retire, maybe before that some people are still in school, let's say. Working age adults, all men are either employed or looking for a job, roughly. And then there's some few percentage points which are not doing that. What about women? It's less than 30%. It's about 20%. In the last 20 years, India has grown a lot. Right? Economic growth has been enormous in India. Has female labor force participation gone up or went down? Now it's 20%. How was it about 20 years ago?
How is agricultural work included?
It's included. So if you work in your own farm, we can talk about this, right? Which kind of work is included? Agricultural work is included.
I would say increased.
I would guess that it's stagnated.
Yeah, if I'm asking this is because it's surprising, right? So it has increased. Decreased. It was something like 24, and now it's something like 20. Okay. And this is very puzzling, right? The level is puzzling, right? Why is it the case that only 20% of women in India participate in the labor market? And then why is this going down as the Indian economy is growing a lot? And so you imagine wages are increasing, employment, labor demand is increasing, but still you don't see reduction. So, and those are the kind of things, right? And then of course you can this is an extreme case, and you can imagine like what does that mean for not only kind of gender-based equality and justice, but also things like think of like the distribution of talents in the Indian economy. Right? If you believe that talent or I don't know, innovation potential is equally distributed between men and women, the fact that only 20% of women participate in the labor force is kind of a huge tax on talent, a kind of unexploited potential. Right? And again, it's not obvious like what is the economic explanation for that, right? There's nothing, it's very difficult to think of a neoclassical economic model where it will deliver this outcome. So there must be something else going on. Okay, so I will show now, this is kind of the motivation, right? This is very exciting. What I say now about gender, you could of course make intersection, you could say. In some areas this is of course interacts a lot with race, with India like with caste, with social class, with urban rural, and so on. Okay, so here are some facts for Latin America. So what is interesting, and you've also seen the Indian case, is there's been a lot of progress in reducing gender inequalities in some areas, and then paradoxically a lot of very few progress in other areas. And to simplify it a bit, there's a lot of progress in education, health, and fertility. So fertility has gone down, health inequalities have gone down, and education inequalities are more or less closed. In many countries with Latin America, they have reversed. So now kind of boys and young men have lower education than women. So the gender gap flipped. In labor markets, there's very few progress, or very small. Okay? Which is another layer of a puzzle. We would expect it kind of, if we close gender gap in education, in health, in other things, in kind of human capital, then kind of the labor market inequalities should also reduce. Because more educated women are arriving, they have higher human capital, and so on. And we don't see that in many regions or from many dimensions. So that's another puzzle, which makes this very interesting. Okay, so for Latin America, here's the education data. And the way you read those graphs, they will all have the same structure. Is there are like three groups of Latin American economies: kind of high income, that's Argentina, Chile, Panama, Uruguay. They are average, and then it's kind of a comparison group, OECD, which are this club of rich Western countries. Then upper middle income, it's Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Peru, and it's average. And then lower middle income, which is Bolivia, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Paraguay, and the average. The blue bars are always men, and the color lines between yellow the rates of secondary school completion. So what is the percentage of people between 25 and 34 which have completed secondary schooling? And you see women have higher completion rates nowadays in Latin America. This is data from 2018.
Yes, are they all on the same scale? I can't see the numbers from here. Like, are they all
Yeah,
on the
they're
same
all the same scale, so you can compare across A, B, and C. Yeah.
Why do you think this gender aspect flipped with the completion rates? Like that more women start completing their education than men? Why do you think that is?
That's a huge debate, right? And that's something you see here as well. So like in our societies, right? So there's a lot of theories, right? So there's some which say young men, their cognitive development occurs later relative to women. So there are some people who say young boys are going to school too early. There are some authors who say girls should start school at age 6. That's kind of the norm. But boys should only enter at age 7 because they're too immature at the beginning. And then if you put them together, then it's also this kind of negative effects. There's also kind of gender roles, right? I think women are socialized to be, much more obedient, much more responsible, which are all things which are kind of good traits for your school life. And boys are maybe socialized to be more rowdy, more physically active, more, less obedient, more risk averse, more competitive, whatever. Maybe those are traits which are not so valued at school, but those are all kind of speculations, right? But anyway, it's reversed, right? And in some cases, the gap is huge nowadays. So look at Uruguay, roughly half of women have high school degrees, only 28% of men. It's a huge gap in the other direction. There are actually, I think, only 2 countries, Peru and Bolivia, where the gap is in the traditional way, the historical way, but it's tiny. It's about to flip as well. Okay, so this cannot be the explanation. In India, it's actually similar. Okay. This is higher education. Which is very similar. Look at the OECD gap. It's huge. Right? Yeah.
Do you know when it flipped? Like roughly the years?
Not, kind of the last 20 years, but it depends on how you raise countries and also like which age group you take into account. But roughly the last 20 years. Okay, so this is kind of a lot of progress. Perhaps now the inequalities we should be worried about is the men who are falling behind in the education system. And then that makes it even more interesting why then this is still why we still have these traditional gender roles in the labor markets, right? Which is that if you look at this, why is it still the case? You would expect the other way around, right? Yeah.
Do we also have the data on like which fields they go in afterwards? Like there's a big disparity in like women going to engineering and stuff.
Yeah. So you still observe that. So it's still there are more women having university education, but you still have those big segregation by field in this kind of stereotypical way. But STEM is much more science, technology, engineering, and math is much more male dominated, and things like social studies, humanities are more female dominated. Okay, so look at the male bars. It's what I told you in India is kind of it's basically all men And for women, we see it's huge, right? Still much higher than India, right? But still clearly kind of much below still above. And then interestingly, at least for Latin America, like the poorer the country, usually the bigger the gap. And some very large ones, like for example, Guatemala and Honduras, it's about kind of half of the labor force.
If we look at Mexico, is there some, so the informal work, is it, you can't include it, right?
Sure, it's included, yeah. So this is all data based on household surveys. So you go and ask, I don't know, to get to these data points, I would say the average survey is maybe 10, 15 questions where you really ask, in the last week, did you do any of those activities, and try to have a complete enumeration of all possible activities which are counted as work. And it's based on self-reporting.
Because I have a seminar in labor market, and in our data from Mexico, they show around 33% of mothers working in Mexico, so it's very low. Here we see 63.
Yeah. So those are
it's I have census data, so I was
So this is everyone between 25 and 55. So you will have unmarried women there and women who are not currently mothers. But that's a great point because the next thing what we're going to zoom in is, and we're going to see a huge part of the explanation. Why we still see those gaps in the labor markets is motherhood. Okay, so that's going to be the next part. Okay, maybe like a footnote. What counts as work? It's kind of this. It's the same issue as like what's included in GDP or not. It's the same definition, and so. Goods and services which are produced for the market are all included. Doesn't matter if it's formal or informal for those numbers. Goods which are produced for own consumption are included. So think of like agricultural goods and things like that. Services produced for own consumption are not included. And that's very important. That's going to be the next slide. That's a lot of the work women are doing is kind of producing household services, care work, cooking, cleaning, things like that. Okay? And that doesn't count. So if someone is what we would call in kind of colloquial language, a housewife, and does kind of services for the family the whole day, they are not part of the labor force. Okay? But if they work in their own farm and agriculture, they would be part of the labor force. Yeah.
But is this the case in Germany, for example?
Sure.
So mothers working at home in a household, they are included in labor force.
They're not included.
Not, yes.
If that's the only thing they do.
But here also it's not.
Yes, exactly. So it's commented that they are
Sure.
Yes.
In Germany, there's a huge gap if you look at full-time employment. So in Germany, there's a huge. The main margin of the gender gap is not this decision in the labor force or not. This is kind of if you work 1 hour per week, you are in. Okay, it's really kind of we're talking about those who are out and not doing anything labor market related. They're doing other stuff. In Germany, about a third of women are doing part-time work. And so this gender gap, this gender wage gap, and career gaps, they all come from this. The most, like 90% of women are doing something close to full-time jobs, and most women are doing part-time. Okay, but the margin starts with this rate. It's kind of the hours worked in Germany. Okay, so labor force participation. For those who are in the labor force, okay, conditional on being on the labor force, how much are they working? So kind of this is now closer to this distinction, full-time versus part-time. And you see everywhere, many of them have on average something like a 40-hour work week or above. A lot of informal jobs have much higher working hours than 40 hours a week, but it's on average it's about full-time. full-time employment, and women have a bit less than that. Okay. So on average, 5 hours less, people like 1 work day less per week. Okay. On average.
But this includes only the women who
Who
are
are
working.
working for us. Exactly. So now we're just comparing those who are here. Yeah? Okay. And you see countries which have a lot of informality. Bolivia, Peru, where kind of 80% of everyone employed is in informal employment. Ours were kind of huge, right? Even women have, at the end, something like a 40-hour work week on average. These are people who might have a shop, do some kind of job which is literally 12 hours a day, where the shop is open. Okay. Now it gets very interesting. This is a tricky one to get into this, so let's take our time. This shows non-market working hours. Okay? And so these are really kind of this caring for children or the elderly, or doing household chores like cleaning, cooking, shopping, those kind of things. Okay? And then you have the countries as usual. You have the split between what is housework, cleaning, cooking, shopping, and so on, and what is care work, time spent with your kids, with your grandparents, things like that. You have total hours per week again, and then you have those 2 bars, and these I have to look carefully. So you have all these women and men, okay? And then the interesting one is this E. E means women who are employed. Okay, so this for Argentina would be the average woman in Argentina who is not employed spends 60 hours per week in non-market work. If this woman is employed, or the average for employment is 50 hours a week, on top of the job there. Okay? And for men, what this E means is, so the average Argentinian man whose wife is not employed, or spouse is not employed, spends 20 hours a week doing non-market work. If the spouse, the female spouse, is employed, has a job, then they spend, 21 or so. Okay, so the E always refers to the woman. Yeah? Okay? So then this is the kind of the punchline is women do everywhere the vast majority of non-market work. Everywhere. Yeah? Huge gender gap. It's much larger in Latin America than it is, for example, in the US, but it's still there in the US, it's still there in Germany. But in Latin America, it's one of the main issues. It's huge. Right? And whether the woman works or not has a marginal change. Right? So if you're a woman who doesn't work at all, or if you have, what if we saw that, like in Argentina on average, a 44-hour work week, you still have to do 50 hours of non-market work on top. And your husband, in return, maybe contributes 1 hour more if you work. Okay? Okay.
There's this idea in anthropology that care work should maybe be paid to reduce inequalities. Because at the end of the day, they argue that it still enables productivity. Because I mean, like they're taking care of children, for example, but they're going to be the workers at the end. And I wonder what you think of that idea. Because I think it's an interesting approach, but that it wouldn't be practical to enable.
Right. Yeah. I agree. This is all unpaid work. Right?
Yes.
This is work for which there's no wage being paid. And so, ideally, the man would compensate the spouse for this. Right? So the man question is like, how do you enforce it, right? Because you don't observe this and so on. And so there are several ways. One is to say, kind of, the former Soviet Union type is like, how much of this can we outsource to the state? And kind of, we make, I don't know, kitas open the whole day, including weekends, and then we reduce the scare amount. We have kind of, I don't know, community canteens, so that people don't have to cook at home and so on and so forth. That could be something in that direction. The other thing that could be done is that you play with incentives for this not to happen, right? And so you could think of like, when you want to calculate taxes at the household level, that you might penalize households where there is a huge imbalance in terms of earnings. And maybe you have like tax benefits for households where this is more balanced. In Germany, the opposite happens. There's this famous Ehegattensplittung, which is exactly the opposite. The Ehegattensplittung is a tax benefit for women who don't work. Yeah. This is terrible because if there's a divorce later on, women are screwed. For the pension system, women are screwed. They haven't contributed enough. They have very low bargaining power in case of a divorce and so on and so forth. So it's really bad. But it's kind of unreformed. No one. It's one of those things that there's just no democratic majority that agrees on that. Yeah.
But again, how do you want to measure how much care work is being made? Because I mean, also, like, it's highly subjective as well, and that makes it even more complicated. But I think, like, social incentives from the state could be very useful, but to think that it's like a whole market that should be paid like the labor market is kind of, I mean, it is a labor market, but not in terms of like a productive market, but also it is, but